Welcome. My name is Scott Solberg, Associate Director of Research at the Center on Education and Work. On behalf of the Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to an afternoon tea, a conversation series on career and workforce development policies and practice held at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An afternoon tea is also being co-sponsored by the Department of Counseling Psychology and the Wisconsin Career Development Association. Our guest today is Ellen Henson. Until recently, Ellen was the Senior Employment Services Specialist with the International Labor Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. She is co-author of the ILO publication, The Public Employment Service in a Changing Labor Market, which has been translated into 13 languages. She's been a major contributor to ILO publications on career guidance, labor market information systems, and the regulation of private employment agencies. Ms. Henson also conducted a program in management assessments of national employment services around the world and assisted the ministries of labor to draft legislation regarding the operation of public employment services and private employment agencies. She provided technical support to a number of ILO technical cooperation projects throughout the world, participated in training and policy discussions in various settings on employment services and topics. Sounds very busy. Ellen, thank you and for being our guest, and welcome to an afternoon tea.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Our title is Global Challenges, Career Development Needs of Low and Middle Income Countries. And I understand that the International Labor Organization is very focused on these countries, but I thought as to get started, maybe you could just explain what exactly the ILO is and what are some of the activities that you do.
All right. Well, the International Labor Organization isn't quite so well known in the United States as other countries, but actually it's one of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. People in the U.S. may be more familiar with the World Health Organization or the International Atomic Energy Agency, but the United Nations has a number of specialized agencies that really do the technical work in various fields. The ILO is responsible for labor and employment issues, and the ILO is unique in the UN system for two reasons. One is that actually, whereas the United Nations was created after World War II, the ILO was created in 1919 after World War I as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And it was actually created at that time because that was at the time of the Russian Revolution as well, and the leading powers in North America and Europe were concerned about the spread of Bolshevism around the world. So they thought, we need an international organization that's going to try to harmonize the needs of workers with the needs of employers. So the second thing that makes the ILO unique in the UN agencies is that it's tripartite. Its governing structure is made up of governments, employers, and workers, and that gives it a little special flavor. But at the end of World War II, it was pulled into the UN structure. So it has a membership of 183 nations, and it's situated in Geneva, which is Geneva, Switzerland, which is the European headquarters of the United Nations. But it has 14 field offices around the world.
Wow. And so there's an advocacy role going on as well as trying to gather the different kinds of labor market informations pieces, right?
Right, yeah. Right. It's not. It's actually the mandate of the ILO is huge. I mean, we deal with issues from child labor is a big eradication of child labor is a big issue. Maritime, the rights of maritime workers, migration issues, promotion of micro-enterprises, the enforcement of the conventions, which is the international law regarding employment and labor issues, and improvement of labor market information statistics, improvement of ministries of labor in all of their functions.
And so I'm looking for the graduate program that leads to that, a person who goes into something like that. Tell us your story. How did you find yourself in Switzerland in the ILO?
Well, in retrospect, my career path might seem logical, but of course, in progress, it never feels that way. But from a very early age, I was always fascinated by different cultures and why people did things differently in different countries and different parts of the world. And actually, when I was an adolescent, I wanted to be in the Foreign Service or work for a UN organization. And I went to university here and finished with a degree in geography and political science, but also with a teaching certification. And I taught geography briefly, but at that point in my life, I was more interested in urban planning. I came back to Madison looking for a job in urban planning, and there weren't any available, but I got an entry-level job in Wisconsin state government in manpower planning. I wasn't sure what it was, but it sounded interesting. And this was just at the time that the federal government was trying to pull together the job training programs that had existed under the old War on Poverty and the old Manpower Development Act into a new system. And this was being done in a Senate committee that was chaired by by Senator Nelson. And so I was able to get in on helping to create the national legislation and set up the system in Wisconsin, did that, moved around to a few other state agencies, and did planning tasks. Then I decided I wanted to go back to school and get a master's, and I also wanted to travel. And I knew that Sweden, which is one of the areas of my ethnic heritage, was in the 60s and the 70s really the gold standard for labor market policy in the world. They were very good reputation for their labor market policies and programs. And I found a graduate program in the social sciences that was taught in English in Stockholm. So I enrolled in that with the idea of looking at the Swedish system up close. And I did that, then I came back to Wisconsin and got back involved in now employment and training planning, and worked in what's now the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development for 15 years, doing various things, several of which brought me in contact with your department. I worked with job training programs, with employment policy planning, and I finished as the state labor market information director.
Wow.
And of course, Wisconsin Careers gets a lot of their statistics from them.
So that, as I understand it, they were working quite closely with you, because a lot of the fundamental components of good, accurate, and good quality career guidance is going to be based on the quality of the labor market information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was on the board of WIS Careers for a number of years.
Tell us a little bit about the whole. You did a thesis that looked at career guidance and what it was in a school type setting versus an employment setting, and I think it can also kind of set the platform as we start to talk about other countries and some of the cross-cultural issues in that. But some of the themes that came out from the work you've done.
All right.
Yeah.
Actually, I did my graduate paper in Sweden on the difference between career counseling in the school system, the K through 12 system, and in the employment service. And I interviewed people, and the research was published in Sweden. And basically, what I learned was that in the school systems, the counseling was geared towards sending people on to further education, not so oriented towards the labor market. And in the employment service, of course, the pressure and the focus is getting people into the labor market. And while there was some communication between the two, it could have been improved, and people recognized that at the time. What was interesting was that 20 years later, when there was, in the early 2000s, a big initiative between the EU and the OECD and the World Bank a little bit to look at the career guidance area, and country studies done of 35 countries or so. One of the major findings was the same thing, was that the school systems are oriented towards moving people through the educational system, whereas the employment service, labor market services are oriented towards employment and immediate employment.
And the focus being on needing to have career guidance as a centerpiece to this whole process.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it seems like the EU has been doing, in the OECD, they have probably been leading the way in trying to get career guidance as a concept, a definition, and getting it back into some of the policies.
I think so. I think the European Union in the last 5 to 8 years has particularly looked at their demographics and seen a need for lifelong learning and seeing how fast the labor market is changing. Some themes that are being emphasized in other countries, but I think there's been a lot of, a fair amount of energy put into that in European countries.
And the International Center is something John McCarthy's heading up now. It was kind of a product of that.
That's right.
Of that whole process. Maybe you could just briefly touch on that, and kind of it seems like a model for being able to get the concept of career guidance back front and center in the policy area.
Yes, well, the International Center for Career Guidance and
Workforce Policy.
Yeah, something like that. The web link is available, is a very good source of information for, at least in the developed world, I would say, but they're trying to make inroads into developing countries on policy initiatives, program initiatives to promote good practices in the world. Something else that's important about very important about the European Union is that the European Union has made huge investments over the last 15 years to bring what are now its new members in Central Europe and Eastern Europe up to the standards of the European Union, not just in career guidance, but in everything.
Across the domains.
And whereas, for instance, in Central Europe in the 90s, after the fall of the communism, the U.S. initially put quite a bit of money into development projects, but during that time and since then, the EU has made huge investments, and a lot of the networks that have been developed through the European Union have certainly benefited the older members too, but they've particularly benefited the newer members and what they call the countries that are trying to access into the Union. And now there are countries like Croatia, you know, that want to become EU members, and they're trying to meet those EU standards.
And it seems like, as we're talking then, so these countries that are coming in would be considered more in the middle income level of the countries. And one of the ways that we can differentiate them in terms of low and middle is really the infrastructure that's in place, in our case for labor market information and some of the career guidance policies and things. And so maybe that's kind of a good launching point. It seems like the EU has a lot of resources, the United States, Canada. We can count on things being on the internet. We can go out and find things that are written. We can gather those things together. It's not the same as we start to cross over into some of the other countries.
Absolutely. Infrastructure, really, if you look, if you want to start talking about career guidance across the world, there are probably three three things to look at. First of all, that's very ambitious, and it's dangerous to generalize, and you have to. I think it's maybe easiest to talk a little bit about the highest income countries and the lowest, the most challenged countries, but recognize that maybe the majority countries are somewhere in between,
Sure.
including, for instance, the Central European countries or Eastern European countries. But probably the three areas where that are notable to look at are values and economic opportunities and infrastructure. And you're right. I mean, even if you look at the middle income countries, it's not just things like IT access. It's the strength of their government. It's how well their government, their teachers are paid relative to the private sector. It's whether corruption is an issue in these countries. It's certainly things like things that we might take for granted, but whether you have a country that
Electricity, we've got.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
We talk about taking things for granted. Water.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then even policies in terms of how women are being treated, how, like you said, child labor laws. There's a lot of discrepancies internationally.
Right. Well, you maybe the most critical thing between high income and lower income is the existence of a formal economy. I mean, that's not a term that we probably bandy about in the States a lot.
Formal versus
Informal self-employment, informal jobs that exist outside of things like wage and hour laws, employment contracts, minimum wages, safety rules.
let's look at that. So India is a good example.
Right.
Where you have a very small percentage that are in the formal versus the informal. Tell us about that.
Okay, yeah. India, we think of IT, high-tech jobs, booming economy, and part of India is like that. But what people don't realize is that in India, over 90% of the population is still in the informal sector. Which
So what would be some examples?
agriculture, you know, subsistence farming, bartering, self-employment, the little shops that small engine shops, or if you think of the Slumdog Millionaire, you know, the people that are foraging off garbage dumps and selling things, people that disassemble computers that come in from all over the world and take the components out and sell off the sometimes toxic minerals and things like that. 90% of the Indian population are people in there, and they're not protected. A big part of the ILO's work, for example, is to try to do things to bring people out of the informal sector and get them into jobs that are covered by fair labor standards and minimum wage, if not minimum wages, minimum health conditions, occupational health and safety, things like that.
Access to some quality of life indicators.
Yes.
And let's go into some other aspects. So one is certainly the formal and informal. Another issue is the whole issue of values, and that there are many countries who would be in middle and even higher income countries that have certain job sectors that they're not going to do.
Right.
And that has an interesting implication for our lower income countries.
Absolutely. Yeah. well, maybe to back up to talk about things that we take for granted about our own value structure. First of all, I mean, most Americans, when they think about careers, they think about not only just survival, but what's going to give them fulfillment.
Yeah. Meaning.
Meaning.
Life design.
Yes, or even something they're interested in.
Yeah.
You know. And also in OECD industrialized countries, there's a strong emphasis on individual choice and on individual responsibility. This is also in a context of opportunities where there's meritocracy, where hard work is rewarded, where there's upward mobility. There's a feeling you can make your life better. Family and community constraints aren't as strong, and this you see when you look at developing countries. And also more recently, there's particularly an emphasis on the need for lifelong learning and to continue to learn and adapt. If you contrast that with developing countries, and again, you have to realize there's a spectrum.
Yeah.
You know,
it's a wide range.
There's all shades of this. But first of all, the whole society's orientation to the future. And here, this is a bit of a generalization, but you see difference in cultures. For example, Confucian cultures with a Confucian religious, more of a base are more oriented towards progress, towards individual improvement and individual improvement,
working hard and
for the community as well.
Yeah.
Whereas in Hindu based cultures, you see more of acceptance of the status quo, of acceptance of the world as it is, and maybe not quite such a dynamic to improve things. And now that's a generalization, but you can see evidence of that. The role of the state also, or the former role of the state in the former communist countries, you find, and we found this in like working in southeastern Europe or in some of the former Eastern European countries, because in planned economies 20, 30 years ago, people were assigned jobs. They didn't think they were going to have much career choice because the government they'd finish school and the government would assign the job and they would stay in that job. So that for those countries, and also for China and for Vietnam, who continue to be communists, but their economies have liberalized. The whole changing the mindset that you don't wait until you're given a job. You have to seek it out, and you'd have to take more responsibility. That's an incredible psychological shift.
Right.
Yes, but also status constraints, which is what you were asking about earlier. There's a couple different dynamics there. One, and I think maybe you've experienced this yourself, is that in some countries, for the educated population, there are certain occupations that have appropriate status for educated people and jobs that you wouldn't take under any circumstances. You'd rather remain unemployed than take a craft job.
So it would be an example, though, in terms of that. So maybe a country where you see some of this, or an area,
You see this in the Middle East, where for instance, in the Gulf countries, because of their oil wealth. You see none of the native population in construction jobs, in domestic worker jobs, in service jobs. People are educated and they want professional jobs.
So where do these jobs come from then? Where do the people come
Well,
from?
that take the,
Yeah.
well, they come from poorer countries. They come from India, they come from Africa, they come from Sri Lanka or Southeast Asia.
And they're brought in specifically to work in those positions.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But in many ways, that has an economic, there's some economic support for the home countries when that happens as well.
Right. And this is something, and this, to come back to the career guidance topic, is something that we don't think of, I think, too much, at least in the U.S. But when you're looking at career guidance around the world, and the need for it, one of the biggest needs and a place where some innovative things are happening is in the area of migration, because there's a huge proportion of the world is on the move, is moving from one country to another. I can give you a personal example that's a little sad, but I did some work in Moldova a few years ago, and Moldova is the poorest country in Europe. Moldova was part of the former Soviet Union, became independent. It's down next to Romania and southeastern Europe, and that 25% of the population of Moldova has gone abroad to work. I mean, if you would think about that in U.S. terms, it would be like 75 million of the best and brightest people in the United States had to emigrate because they didn't have employment opportunities. And when I was there, my interpreter, I had a lovely young Moldovan woman who was interpreting for me as I visited various agencies, and she was in a family of her parents were close to retirement age. They had been government workers. She had an older brother. The older brother had emigrated to the United States a few years earlier, wasn't coming back. The father had just left to go to Israel to work for a couple years because they had virtually no pension system for them, pension for them to live on in retirement. So he was in Israel, and the woman who was my interpreter was waiting for her visa to go to the U.S. to work as in the hospitality industry, and that came through while I was there. So here is a family of four, three of whom were emigrating or about to emigrate, and imagine and those are the people with the best opportunities. Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
So but those people send a lot of money back to their home countries, and there's some countries that really depend on remittances. Mexico is a country, and the Central American countries.
Well, talk about the Philippines, because it sounds like they've got some very unique support systems in place.
Yeah, the Philippines is really best practice for what they do with their for their overseas workers, and they have a huge number of overseas workers at all skill levels. Doctors and nurses, you'll see a lot of Filipino doctors and nurses in this country, and all the way down seamen, a lot of seamen working all over the world, domestic workers, and people in between. And they have actually an overseas employment agency that separate overseas employment agency linked to their Department of Labor that has a very extensive program to counsel people when they're first trying to make decisions about should I emigrate, which countries might I go to, And then as they get closer to making decisions about this, the people will often get in contact with specific overseas recruitment agencies. The government helps with kind of screening those agencies, and then it helps with, there's actually a legal program that people have to go through so they know what their rights are if they're going to Hong Kong or something. And they also have a program when they come back to help them be reintegrated back into the Philippine economy. And that's a very unusual. But on the other hand, Europe has done a lot, particularly the last few years aside when the economies have slowed down. But Europe has done a lot, particularly
in Ireland, I think, had some.
Ireland, yes, has a program that's called Know Before You Go, where when Ireland was booming and pulling in a lot of migrants from particularly Central European countries, they were anxious that people knew before they came to Ireland what to expect and what kind of jobs were around, so that you got a better match in the economy. And they created a website and a program where the program was called Know Before You Go, and it was a website that was in 14 languages, Polish and Lithuanian and number of languages, that talked about what the job opportunities were, what the occupations were, what the occupational requirements were, but also what the living conditions were, what the cost of housing is, what schooling was like, what the legal requirements were. So someone could be in Poland and go on the website in Polish and find out all these things about Ireland to make a decision about moving there for work.
Very interesting.
And they even had, they would do like recruiting trips where people would go from Ireland to Latvia or as another country like that, and explain these things too.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the motivation. So in parts of Europe, you really need labor.
Right.
And they're looking for, wanting to attract quality workers into certain sectors. And so here's Ireland saying, okay, here's our sectors. And here's the process of getting, we need to make that connection. And all the way then to the Philippines, where you're setting up systems so you can be successful, because economically Philippines is going to gain by your being able to leave and go out and find good quality employment.
Right, right.
That's amazing.
Yes, but also because they want to mitigate the problems where people come and they're not qualified. They come with the wrong expectations. That
it doesn't serve anyone well.
No,
when that occurs.
no, or where they can be exploited.
Let's talk a little bit about, as we look at lower income countries, one of the things that there's been projects, right, for hundreds of years. We're going to help those people do things that are hit and miss. And now there's a millennial project that's going on. So just maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the issues and challenges, what needs to be happening in a concerted effort to help build the infrastructure for career development, for workforce development, things like that.
The infrastructure of the aid, or the infrastructure of the career development, or
both. I mean, in a sense, we're trying to build labor market kinds of structures in place, and as you said, it begins in lower income countries with just building basic infrastructure,
right,
and working on trying to build the quality of life back up and stuff. And I just think it's profound to think about where we start with career development is really basic needs. And there is a UN has a big effort going on to try to support this now. That's maybe making more strides than people might realize.
Right. I think this was the early 1990s, the UN got together and developed something called the Millennium Development goals. And the reason for developing those goals, this overall framework for development around the world, was that so much of development aid, as fine as it is kind of hit and miss. A project, and this isn't just in the workforce development or career guidance area. This is true across the board, but for a number of reasons. One, individual countries will make decisions about what countries they want to invest in and on what theme. I mean, you'll remember that a few years ago, there was the United States made a big commitment to AIDS prevention in the world, and at different times there are different themes, and different countries have different themes and different countries that they target for their own national interests, and these things are all happening independent of each other. So it's if you're Ghana, you know, one day Denmark is saying we want to invest in water in your country, water infrastructure development, and the next month you have Japan saying, oh well, we want to invest in basic education, and these countries have very small bureaucracies, so they're running here and there. So there was an effort to develop Millennium Development Goals, which are kind of an overall framework, and the national economic policies and the donors are supposed to kind of plug into this. And those Millennium Goals particularly target education, basic education, and also health issues and maternal and child health issues. So there's been a lot of investment in basic education. Education for all is the kind of the buzzword for that.
For that one, yeah.
And also maternal and child health. And I've just read very recently that there's been a significant improvement in maternal health in the last few years, but it's still a challenge to coordinate all these efforts. And it's quite interesting. Several months ago, I read an interview with Bill Gates, who was interviewed about the work that he and his foundation have been doing, particularly in the area of child health around the world, and particularly in the area of vaccination, immunization. And what he said that I thought was striking, and it certainly struck a bell with me, was that one of the big surprises for him is getting involved in the vaccination program, was that he thought the real challenge was going to be in developing the vaccines for some of these diseases that have resisted
treatment for a long time.
Right. But he said at least as challenging has been the delivery of those vaccines. And he talked about, for example, the cold chain, where for a vaccine to be useful, you have to keep it refrigerated from the time it's developed till it gets get it in the field to where it's going to be used. And in some places
you just don't have electricity, and you don't have the basic home infrastructure.
No, refrigeration is not known. But in things like in our field, you have to recognize that basic education. I mean, in the poorest countries, you really have to work for literacy and basic education. You also have to work that in the educational systems, the upper secondary and the career and the technical college, and even in the university areas, that modernization of vocational and technical education is critical. I went into a vocational school in India a few years ago, and they were still using equipment that had been installed in 1959.
Wow.
when the school was built, because they didn't have any money to modernize, and some of the teachers had been maybe not teaching quite that long ago, but for a long time. And the notion, a lot of, for instance, in Africa, of the colleges and technical colleges were developed not long after the countries became independent, and some of them have locked in place. Now, there are other places that are moving ahead very quickly, but that's a problem.
Wow.
Another problem is labor market information and the lack of it.
Yeah, and that's a big issue.
Right.
And just to kind of summarize, you're talking about countries where basic skills, availability of occupations, the country infrastructure where there's at least safety and some kind of, you talk about so much informal economy. In part that's because there hasn't been some kind of rules or policies put in place to support some of the entrepreneurials and some of the other different activities going on. Labor market information is a critical issue in this whole process, and this would be a good time maybe to talk a little bit about, and also even to get from your standpoint as an advocate from the ILO, what needs to happen in terms of some additional support to look at labor market information, to get it available and get things going. Yeah.
Well, one thing you have to remember, if you go back to the issue of poor countries having a large informal economy, that if you have people working in the informal economy in self-employment, they're generally not registered, so you don't have business records, you don't have tax records, you don't have unemployment compensation records, because of course there isn't unemployment compensation in these countries, or the people aren't covered by it. So some of our labor market information in the United States comes from surveys, from surveys of people, comes from surveys of businesses, but it also comes from administrative records. It comes from unemployment compensation records from employers.
So in the United States, you get unemployment data from the state. It gets dropped at the federal level, and then it can pool and tell us what are the industry sectors that people are working in, what are the ones that are the hot ones perhaps coming out. There's a lot of information that can happen.
Absolutely.
You don't have that in these other countries.
Well, some countries more than others. Some countries had, certainly the OECD countries have very well developed
but in the lower income countries, it's much
spotty.
more of a challenge. Yeah.
It's spotty, and it's doing a census, doing labor force surveys is a challenge. That's something that the ILO has been for years helping countries with, is trying to
and that's the
establish
first
that.
step for
And
labor market information, is just to figure out what are people doing.
Right. Yes, but the value of labor market information comes from doing these surveys repeated, so you can look at the trend, what the trends are.
Right.
And if you may do a labor force survey once every 5 years, once every 10 years in some of these countries, and that's much more difficult. One thing that the ILO has done just in the last 5 or 6 years is develop something that's called key indicators of the labor market, where we've tried to identify about 20 labor market indicators that come from different sources that we think can tell the story help a country tell the story and understand what's going on in their labor market. And this is more for economic planning, less for career planning. but we try to use those to help countries shape where they need to make efforts to improve their labor market statistics.
What are some countries that have made some big strides in the last 20 years? We've talked about India. There's been obviously a lot of change going on. China.
In statistics or in general?
Just as the labor, that are starting to pull together some of this labor market information and beginning to move up in terms of providing, it's in a sense, once you have the labor market information, you can start directing to some extent and supporting people in the labor market because you have an idea of what skills are out there, what's needed, and different things.
Well, I'm impressed by China. I mean, with the huge challenges that they've had, they've made some very great, very significant strides in the last 10 years or so. But countries like Barbados and Jamaica in the Caribbean have put together labor market information systems that are on the internet, and they've received assistance from the United States. Mexico has put together a system. They have a labor market observatory that tries to do some analysis of what's going on in the labor market. Several of the Latin American countries, I think Chile and Argentina, are just in the last few years trying to develop their labor market information better.
And it seems like that it must have an impact as they are needing extra funding support. They can begin to articulate where that support should go as they get this labor market information together. So there's a lot of motivation to get this information.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think some of the North African countries are, again, they're getting assistance from the European Union, and they've been improving their labor market statistics.
Sure.
There are bright spots all over, but there's a lot of work
still to be done.
do.
Yeah,
Yes.
a lot more to be done. We had a question come in actually from Heather about, and it's really having to do with the adult development, and probably in more of the higher income countries. There's a lot of emphasis now on continuous development and providing access to adults for career guidance and employment services. How does the U.S. and the EU compare in terms of how we're approaching this adult population?
Well, actually, I can't. I'm really out of touch with the U.S. now.
Because you've been off in Switzerland for so long.
I've been in the rest of the world, and haven't kept up to date with the U.S. But I know that in this study that was done in the early 2000s by the OECD and the EU, they found one of the areas of weakness in the area of career guidance was preparing people for what they call active aging. So that I think they're making more efforts at that, but you have to realize that Europe is facing, even more so than the United States, a demographic issue with the aging of the population. So is Japan, and I think that it's catching up. It's catching up to them, but it's not something that they've been very proactive about, according to this study.
Yeah, it seems like it does seem like the European Union has a unique opportunity to be trying to allow different countries to try to innovate some of the workforce development things. I was looking at the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network as one of the new ones to kind of emerge out of this, to really try to incubate some best practices across the countries and then kind of communicate it across.
Right.
I think in the U.S. the one-stop job centers is still probably the primary, one of the primary tools, as well as career systems within the colleges, the tech colleges, and the 2-year, 4-year universities. So I think there's a lot we can learn across borders in this process. And I know Canada's been doing a lot of exciting work
Yes.
in the career development as well.
Absolutely. And Canada, I think, has been a leader in career development for a number of years. They have one initiative, and there are several of these around the world, but one that's particularly interesting to me, it's called the Career Circuit and the Circuit Coach. And a lot of the career development now in Canada, as I understand, is not provided in employment offices, but it's been outsourced to community agencies. And they have something called the Career Circuit, where there's a huge network of youth nonprofit agencies that serve youth, not just for career counseling, but for a number of youth services. And they have access to this like online resource center and toward a training program, and also two kind of field coordinators who are trying to raise the knowledge level and the awareness level of career development in all of these nonprofit agencies that are touching youth in a number of ways. And I think that's quite innovative. And I think it's also it's a indicator of how increasingly, I think, in different countries, both in more prosperous countries and in poorer countries, what we're finding in career development is that a lot of service points, I guess you could call them, exist that are often uncoordinated, and they're composed of people that are with different levels of preparation. In fact, in this European study I've been referencing, they found that the amount of training for people providing career development service varied from 3 weeks to 5 years.
Wow.
So you have people in different service points that are with different levels of education, with that are serving different client groups, that are in different types of organizations and different service levels. Some are very well-resourced, some are not. And that increasingly, to be effective, people are going to have to learn to coordinate those kinds of resources and find ways to support those kinds of resources across all those variations.
It's really about accessibility.
Right.
And I think, in the United States, the parallels we have would be the National Career Development Association's certified being a career development facilitator.
Right.
And then also the Institute on Educational Leadership has a whole collaborative of youth-serving organizations that are trying to work on the academic, the career, and the kinds of developmental skills. But it sounds like Canada has a lot of coordination going on with a lot of these different infrastructures.
Well, I think they've been working hard. They've been working hard at. But actually, I mean, that's behind the Wisconsin Careers and being, getting that into
career information systems
job
available.
Centers and schools and things,
That's
and behind the job center concept.
Right. Oh yeah, and making it a lifelong process.
Right.
So we have a question. I'm going to have a tough time pronouncing this person's name, so I apologize up front. But Sonia Frey Harper would like to know about your job. What were the main obstacles that you had in doing your work? And I think you could probably start with, there was how many in your office? 25, 30, 400?
No, there were 1 to 2.
180 countries? How many countries were you in?
183 countries, and 1 to 2 people responsible for providing support to improving employment services, workforce development services, and regulating private employment agencies.
Wow.
You pick your battles.
I guess you do. and I think, something we had talked about before we started was this idea that unfortunately you really had to have more of a helicopter perspective of this whole thing.
Right.
You really had to step on the bigger picture, and I guess that means really trying to focus on advocacy for policies. And I think you've done some big work trying to bring together countries to make certain agreements.
Right.
Maybe you could talk a little about that, because that's certainly one of the exciting things that I think must have happened from your work.
Sure. Well, one of the most rewarding things that I did, and again, I have to say that the career guidance work that I did and the handbook that we published was kind of a side endeavor of mine. I worked on that for a few years. That wasn't the focus of my work, but I saw a huge need for that, and particularly after the research that was done in the OECD countries, it was clear that some effort needed to be done for the rest of the world.
And this booklet, but just to kind of put in a little plug for it, you've basically gone through these many different countries and tried to pull out some of the practice strategies that are going on.
Right, right. Because to address the issue of your caller, really one of the biggest issues is that it's really hard to bridge the gap between the systems, the infrastructure, the value structures that we have in the OECD, the upper income countries, and be able to translate that into the societies that we're trying to help. You can't just plunk. You can maybe take Wisconsin Careers and put it in Singapore, which is at the high end of a middle income.
They have IT infrastructure, the online systems.
Good
South
educational.
Africa, it's going to be via cell phones. You're just not going to have
Right.
the same kind of IT infrastructure.
And financing it is out of the question. So you have to find ways to build on what exists and make it realistic to be sustainable after a project ends, both in terms of the financial resources and also the human resource infrastructure. So that's a big that's a big challenge, and that's where a lot of international aid falls down. But one of the things that was particularly rewarding for me was that I worked with the World Association of Public Employment Services, which is the association of the directors and top administrators of national employment services around the world. It would be the equivalent of the head of the Employment and Trading Administration in the U.S. Department of Labor. And it was about 85, 90 countries. That was small budget. Its staff were loaned from National Employment Services, but they provided seminars and workshops on different topics around the world. And one of the real values of them was we could attend those meetings and pick up a lot of information on what was going on where in the world and what countries were doing things that were interesting and worth investigating. Because one of the difficult things about doing research at the international level is that if you get out of Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other countries, it's very hard to find information. I mean, on the internet or anywhere else, language is clearly an issue.
Sure.
But just to find information in a language that you can understand, French, English, or Spanish is a challenge.
Wow.
So this organization was particularly good to try to find things. But for the career guidance handbook, as I said, after this exhaustive research on Europe, mainly Europe and North America and some other OECD countries, although the U.S. was not involved in this. The thought is how, with a much smaller amount of resources, could we begin to look at the rest of the world and incorporate some of the good practices in developing countries.
Sure.
So we got a international a firm that did data mining in general in the whole in areas related to employment and labor that worked in 5 or 6 languages, and they did an internet search to try to find 500, 600 sites that had anything to do with career guidance in English, Spanish, or French. And then I used a couple techniques and a couple experts, including someone who's sitting in the audience here today, who is a former SOIC director in Wisconsin, to screen some of those resources and try using a number of criteria. And then we used some other, found some other research from some other countries, commissioned a few papers from people who are working internationally, and then we did a first draft. And the idea with this particular handbook, which I thought would be useful, was rather than to write another handbook on, you know, what color is your parachute kind of handbook, which actually someone else had tried a few years earlier, and it was very Western, U.S. oriented, IT, you know, oriented. We thought that it would be good to give people kind of a buffet of internet sites in French and English and Spanish as best we could. Those are the 3 official languages of the ILO. And let them see what were good practices, both in developing, both in upper income countries,
as well as the developing.
and in where there are good practices in middle and lower income countries, and let them pick and choose. And the idea was that they wouldn't all develop their own websites, but for instance, if they wanted to put together a job guide for youth, you know, a paper, a print, a little print handbook or something to give to youth, that they could look at these websites, and there are lots of examples on websites in the different languages that could be adapted to print, which is more practical in a lot of lower income countries. So that was how the idea for the handbook evolved.
And it really, I mean, you take the limited resources you have in terms of time and people, and you put a collection like this together, and as you indicated, countries can kind of see where they fit, but they can also compare where they can go, you know, and they can start to see some of the other practices and see that as these countries are developing different levels of infrastructure, new possibilities can emerge. And it's just really, it's a very exciting piece.
Well, and it's a little, and it's also plays on the fact that if your neighbor is, doing something,
you better
just
be,
like the states in the U.S., you know,
Sure.
if Minnesota is doing something, Wisconsin is going to pay attention to that.
That's right. Very good. Or the other way around, too.
Or the other way around.
I just want to clarify that. All right. Well, thank you. Well, this has been an afternoon tea with the Center on Education and Work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Do visit our website at cew.wisc.edu to find out about our annual Careers Conference, our online career information system, the WISC Careers and Career Locker, as well as our other professional development opportunities related to translating the career and workforce policy and research into practice. Look to our afternoon tea website to find out how to gain continuing education credit for viewing the tea conversations, as well as links to view any of the tea conversations. We have a number at this point that we have at least 12 now that are up and running. We had 4 from local, as well as 8 that have been more of a national, international character. I want to thank Bernard Sue for his invaluable help in coordinating the event, along with Nancy Mitchell and Anthony Hernandez for the graphic support. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of Counseling Psychology and the Wisconsin Career Development Association, the Pyle Center as well for the UW Extension facility for its technology support, and just all the behind-the-scenes things that they do to make this afternoon tea available to an international audience. So So on behalf of the Center on Education and Work, I want to express our thanks to Ellen Henson for today's conversation. Thank you very much. It was very nice.
It's a pleasure.